So some of you guys may be familiar with Carlos Caro. He used to be with RGV NORML down in the Valley, the Rio Grande Valley, but now we are lucky enough to call him the Secretary for Texas NORML. He's an educator, and he's here to talk to us about the impacts of prohibition as it relates to the border. So without further ado, I am going to unmute Carlos and spotlight your video, and I'm turning it over to you, Carlos.
All right, thank you, Jax. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you to everybody out there who's joined us throughout the day today. To all the musicians, all the speakers, thank you so much for your time and for your effort. So with that said, my name is Carlos Caro. I've been the Secretary of the Board for Texas NORML for the past couple of years or so. And then before that, I was active in activism down in the Rio Grande Valley, setting up a regional chapter of NORML, RGV NORML. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share a slide here with everybody. And it's going to be, let's see here, yes. It's going to be essentially a few talking points to keep what I'm going to be discussing with everybody, kind of give everybody kind of a heads up of what we'll be discussing here. So with that said, I'm going to be covering these 3 points here. Just go history of prohibition in the borderlands, the militarization of the border, and then the importance of ending the war on drugs overall as a whole. So with that said, I want to go ahead and begin with a brief history of prohibition in the borderlands, specifically about the Rio Grande Valley. Borderlands here in Texas, they have had a long history of smuggling, of prohibition, and of the associated violence that goes along with that. Going back to the Civil War, the Rio Grande Valley, specifically Brownsville, Texas, was utilized by the Confederacy to go around Union blockades. So that way they could take their shipments of cotton and other cargo into Matamoros, Mexico, and have that shipped all over the world. And, there's a lot of local history down there regarding the Civil War and many battles that took place regarding these trade routes with the Union Army trying to seal these off. Moving along, because I do have much to cover in the 15 minutes we have, moving along from the time period between 1910 and 1920, we did see a massive rise in basically racially motivated state-sponsored violence done on the behalf of the Texas Rangers as well as vigilante groups. Now, in the midst of this time period, we are seeing massive turbulence in Mexico with the Mexican Revolution, along with a plan that was uncovered in 1914 known as the Plan de San Diego. And that set off a lot of alarm bells up here in Austin, Texas. And they responded with violence. And we're going to see a few of those echoes coming along in modern day a little bit later in these talking points. Coming along in the 1920s with the prohibition of alcohol, the Rio Grande Valley again was a hotbed for the smuggling of alcohol into the United States. There are reports, not solidly verified, but there were reports that Al Capone set up some networks down there to bring in liquor into the United States. And what is now known as the Gulf Cartel, more commonly associated with human smuggling and drug smuggling, they got their start with the smuggling of alcohol during this time period into the Rio Grande Valley. Now, using that as our backdrop with regards to prohibition and its effects on the border, I want to move us along into the militarization of the border. Now, when we talk about militarization of the border, there's 2 routes that we can take this discussion. We have state militarization of the border, and primarily we'll be talking about the Department of Public Safety when we discuss this aspect. And then we have the federal militarization of the border, and we'll be primarily talking about Customs and Border Protection, CBP, in response, both responses, state and federal, to the war on drugs overall as a whole. Now, starting with the state militarization of the border through primarily the Department of Public Safety. Again, to ground our brief conversation on the Department of Public Safety, it's important to understand that much of what we know as the border surge, much of what we know as the buildup and the rise within the last 7-8 years of a state presence on the Rio Grande border, on the Rio Grande Valley's border with Mexico, it comes from a private company. Essentially, former General John Abrams set up a private contracting company known as Abrams Learning and Information Systems. And this company has been credited as essentially being the architects of what we now see today going down in the Rio Grande Valley, at least on the state level. And it was through this private company that joint intelligence centers and military-style commands were set up throughout the state, primarily on the Rio Grande Valley, down on the border, again, through DPS. This wasn't the only private partnership that DPS entered into. They also entered into a partnership with a firm that was founded by Chris Kyle here in Texas that trained their aviator airmen to shoot from helicopters. And essentially it was this partnership with these private groups that led to a very tragic incident in 2012 in the small town of La Joya, Texas, where a DPS officer fired from a helicopter onto a vehicle that was unarmed and didn't present any necessary danger to the public. And in the process, they ended up killing a number of undocumented immigrants. Now, to DPS's credit, they did reverse that policy shortly after that, but it goes to show, typically when we talk about the militarization of the border, we look at it through the lens of the federal government. And we talk about the military industrial complex at the federal level as well. But it's important to understand that the military industrial complex does play a heavy role in our state law enforcement as well, at least here in Texas. Now, that being said, when DPS began their surge in earnest in 2013, they primarily focused in on the Rio Grande Valley, yes, as a whole, but two specific regions. They focused in on Western Hidalgo County, and they focused in on Starr County as a whole. About to learn right now when we transition over into the federal militarization of the border, when you combine what DPS was doing at the time with federal efforts, it made Western Hidalgo County and Starr County overall as a whole some of the most surveilled areas in the entire United States for a good chunk of time there, from 2013 to now. Now, that being said, when the surge began in 2013, DPS began to send a large number. They started to pull them away from their standard areas that they were deployed to throughout the state. And they started to set up checkpoints in essentially residential areas. And DPS was saying that the reasons for this was to check for insurance and for drivers. And while that may have been the initial purpose, the question is begged to be asked, was this done at anywhere else throughout the state? And the answer is no. And I point back to the early history that we looked at, where the Rio Grande Valley, the borderlands overall as a whole, but specifically the Rio Grande Valley, they've been politicized for the longest time. And again, that's no different what we see today, both at the state and federal level. To close out our brief discussion here with state militarization of the border, I want to give everybody here a few statistics so that everybody can understand where your tax dollars are going to. So a few legislative sessions ago, the state went ahead and allocated about $800 million of Texas taxpayer funds for all of this adventurism on the border. And what that $800 million went to, still a small sample. And again, what I'm presenting here is just a brief sample of what we're able to get our hands on with regards to information. It's been notoriously difficult to get reliable statistics and information coming out of DPS. Director McGraw and his cohort over there at DPS, they're reliably difficult in getting information out when requested. Now, that being said, what we do know is that DPS currently on the Rio Grande River operates 6 gunboats. Each of these gunboats have 6 M240 machine guns, and each of these boats is approximately at $580,000 each. Now we're not talking about the U.S. Navy. We're talking supposed to be a civilian police department, and again, 6 gunboats on the Rio Grande River. And again, this is not to say that the federal government's not doing their part. The federal government has their own gunboats on the river, and this is on top of that already. We also know that DPS operates 2 high altitude spy planes, one of those coming in at a cost of $7.4 million. The other cost of the other one is unknown as far as the research that I was able to go into. And again, that's just a small sample of where this money is going towards. I think it's very illuminating considering the budget windfalls that we're about to go into in the very near future and the economic situation that we find our state in. Now, that being said, let's go ahead and transition over to the federal militarization of the border, because there's a lot to be said there. And when I often talk about this point about federal militarization on the border, I'd like to give the example of empire. And throughout time, we see that the weapons that empires use on the periphery of their empire, control and subjugate peoples, it's always brought back home to be used against the home populace in the home country. And it's no different in our modern era. As of 2017, again, this is from what we understand, as of 2017, there are 6 rapid aerostat initial deployment blimps, they're known as RAID blimps, deployed between Brownsville, Texas and Laredo, Texas. And these blimps are fresh off the battlefield of Afghanistan and Iraq. And you would think that these blimps are mostly in rural areas, and some of them are, but some of them aren't. And I can personally attest to this. In my parents' home, the home I grew up in La Jolla, Texas, one of these blimps is erected essentially in a residential, working middle class neighborhood. And you could read the tail numbers off of the blimp. In fact, you could see the machinery, what we're assuming is a camera, working inside. And this is from a working middle class neighborhood down in La Jolla in Western Hidalgo County. Aside from this, we also know that CBP is using Predator drones along the border. Now, granted, these are unarmed, but they are battlefield weapons field technology. And along with this, you know, we have every letter of the alphabet federal agency down there. So, you know, with the DEA, for example, we understand that there have been instances of them using questionable evidence in the manner in which they gather that, using NSA information. And a lot of this information we understand through the Snowden revelations revealed in 2012. And through this information that the DEA gets from the NSA, again, partially question mark around the legality of that, we see cases being created out of what's known as parallel construction. So we see the government concealing their methods in which they used to gather the evidence against the accused and present a different form, right? A whitewashing of the manner in which they use to gain the evidence to protect the illicit methods in which they use. And this is known as parallel construction. I mean, this is another negative aspect of the war on drugs overall as a whole. Again, when we talk about of empire being brought home, you know, we have Stingray devices that are used to mimic cell towers that are deployed on street lamp posts. They're deployed in police vehicles. It can be put in a briefcase-sized device. License plate radar readers, the use of pretext stops at all levels of law enforcement. So, you know, they'll pull you over for a supposed traffic violation. However, that's not the real reason. The real reason is more insidious. They want to get within speaking distance of you and see if there's any quote unquote narcotics violations or questions that they could plan on you or the such. I have been the victim of this multiple times when I lived in the Rio Grande Valley, specifically by the Department of Public Safety. You know, this being said, I know I dumped a lot of information on everybody, but it's important to know what's going on with our tax dollars. And, you know, the importance of ending the war on drugs is multifold, right? I mean, we can speak to the manner in which our civil liberties are being violated on a daily basis, especially for the residents down in the Rio Grande Valley. We can speak to the internal checkpoints 70 miles inland from the US-Mexico border. We can talk about what's known as essentially constitutional exemption zones 100 miles inland between every land and sea border, which is a big reality for folks down there that have to cross through that inland checkpoint in the Rio Grande Valley. You know, we can talk about taxpayer burden, where all of our money is going into, considering the economic collapse that we're about to be facing very soon, with economists pointing to not only the Great Recession, but the Great Depression with regards to unemployment numbers and the like. We can point to the racial discrimination that is rampant in all of our communities that we speak of. So, you know, the list is endless there with regards to why we should end the war on drugs. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their attention. I understand it was a lot of information that I gave on a lot of people. And I'd like to encourage everybody to come out to our next digital meeting, which I will be emceeing. It will be the first Wednesday of May. I believe it is May 4th, if I'm not mistaken. Jax, please correct me. And yeah, thank you everybody for your time.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you for reminding me. I should take the link to the virtual meeting information and drop it in the comments. So I will do that. And, you know, you can never say that we don't keep it real at Texas NORML, talking about the military industrial complex on 420, you know. So thank you for doing some thoughtful research and making sure that we can have a better understanding of what's going on.